Welcome to a unique look at NTT's best practices for cybersecurity incident management and response, which is based on NTT's Global Threat Intelligence Report. There are several different organization threat reports that have been published around the world, but NTT wanted to present to you a behind-the-scenes perspective of our own threat report as it relates to digital forensics and incident response, to the digital forensics and incident response team. My colleague and I, Dan, we're actually soldiers in the field. So for this presentation, the stories are real. The names have not been changed. We just cannot say their names. This is not fake news, because in reality, the cry of the wolf is real in organizations. So for this webinar, we encourage you to ask questions. You can submit them through the Bright Talk portal, and depending on your question, we may answer them on the spot or wait until the end of the presentation. Also on the portal is a lot of other pertinent information, such as if you get a chance to visit the attachments and link section as well. The agenda for this presentation is comprised of 4 areas. We will first lay the groundwork for using the 6 key findings that are documented in the Global Threat Intelligence Report. If you have not reviewed the report, you should download it, but not now, but after the presentation, if you don't mind. Next, we will present what we consider to be the 5 challenges for us as a DFIR team that we encounter during a cybersecurity incident. And these 5 challenges or perspectives we're going to go through are based upon the 6 key findings that you will see across the board, which makes it very challenging for us. With respect to the presentation, you will notice that we will talk about the incidents and some of the things we encounter or organizations encounter before the attack, during an attack, or after an attack. Next in the presentation, as a part of the agenda, we will present the landscape model, or if you will, the playing field that organizations have to address. And in this particular landscape model, we'll discuss the world from the attacker's perspective, the assets that the attackers are targeting, and the threat model types that we use. And it's important to realize that when we talk about threat models, it is really not a dark art. And then finally, we will present what we consider to be the overall best practices from a DFR perspective as we align with the 6 key findings. In essence, what we're saying is that when you go through the 6 key findings in the Global Threat Intelligence Report, we will present to you from our side as DFIR consultants what we see and what we experience in this environment across the board. I am Terrence Lillard. I'm a senior consultant residing in the Americas. I have over 20 years of enterprise and DoD IT and security experience, forensic and incident response experience, and I am also one of the NTT technical blog writers as well also. And as always, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague and peer, Dan Sanders. Combined, we ensure that the sun does not set on the NTT Global DFIR practice by providing support to our clients across all time zones. Dan?
Yep, Dan Saunders, based in the UK, working alongside Terence and loads of other technical folk and skilled. My history is working within UK law enforcement industry, within cybercrime unit, investigating network intrusions and other cyber attacks, with other experience around research and development, digital forensic investigation and analysis of compromised networks. So, as Terence has already mentioned, we'll be basing passing across some of our thoughts and opinions and experience based on some of the findings that were the key findings from this year's GTIC or Global Threat Intelligence Report. In terms of this year's report, threat researchers from NTT identified 6 key findings which were of major significance for today's cyber threats, which were observed and analysed. First of all, innovation by threat actors. So in terms of this, APT groups are continuously developing their TTPs when it comes to carrying out cyber attacks. They're getting smarter in theory. Not only are they developing their toolkits, but they're also looking to reduce the chance of any detection and increase their capabilities as well. That they are being smarter when it comes to decision making and gaining a foothold within your environment. They do not just care about encrypting data anymore, but they're also thinking about what else they can leverage to gain an advantage over their victims. This is one of the key findings that we'll be looking at shortly. In addition to that, weaponization of IoT is up there as well. Swarms of network-related devices operating as parts of botnets are being utilized to scan and exploit IoT devices for malicious intent. We're not simply focusing on common IT infrastructure anymore, and we'll be looking in this presentation at how some of the botnets are being utilized nowadays. Next, as we kind of see time and time again on our own incident response engagements worldwide, pains me to say it, but we still see old vulnerabilities left in situ unpatched. These are being actively scanned by attack groups and exploited. We're going to be looking at this shortly in the presentation as well, and provide some recommendations on how best to mitigate these threats. Top of the table for the last year were threats associated to content management systems. There's various types of platforms out there. We'll be looking at some examples of those. However, the patterns are fairly familiar amongst them all, and these platforms are frequently being attacked to not only infiltrate them, but also to facilitate further cyber attacks. Towards the end of this presentation, we'll be looking at governance, risk and compliance, which is now more complicated than ever, especially in industrial environments. Legislation is evolving, and now it's more important than ever to ensure your processes are up to scratch and you're meeting compliance standards. Last but by no means least, we'll be looking at the terms of a shift in the sector targeting. So it's not a case of anymore completely fishing in the wild. There's a lot of targeted attacks out there, and we've all read in recent months about the threat of ransomware everywhere hitting major organizations. Where is ransomware primarily released? Tech firms. Who has the money? Potentially big tech firms or engineering firms. So we'll be looking into this later and shedding some of our experience on what we've encountered and some of our recommendations for how to deal with this. Whilst they were the main 6 key findings from this year's GTIC report, it goes without saying that the current COVID-19 pandemic has affected most organisations' ability to deliver secure IT infrastructure to their employees. And obviously many of those are working from home. Adversaries are adapting to this as well and turning this to their advantage when crafting their attacks. So it's important that we stay ahead of the game and also adapt and change as security professionals and organisations as well. Often security will take a back seat but we need to be relying on our technology to deliver the services, and we need to make sure that we are going to continuously improve our security posture. So hopefully some of the recommendations we'll be providing during this presentation will help support that.
Thank you, Dan. That's very good information. So what we're going to do is that we're going to take those 6 key findings and talk about what does it mean from the DFIR's different perspectives. Well, to answer that question, as we look at the key different findings, from the first perspective, and this is a unique one, in that it requires each member to be if you will, to take on as a lead in an engagement. And as a lead in an engagement, it requires us to use sound, investigative, forensic, and root cause skills. And it's ironic, as I see some questions that are coming in. So since from that perspective about what is a priority to us in terms of a DFIR team, let me drill down a little bit on that in terms of a skill set. What does it really mean to really talk about an investigative forensic skill set? Or what are the categories, or as I call it, the art of the investigation? This skill set for us, when we approach a lot of these engagements, especially as it relates to the key findings, I kind of break them down into 15 different areas. As a investigator, first and foremost, since the question was, what do we need to do, or what skill set do we need to have? What is the priority? Is that we have to have the tenacity to investigate and to drill down and to continue relentlessly as we try to identify what is occurring in the environment. Self-control is an important component of it. The skill set of being curious, curiosity, is another important component. Patience, because some of these investigations do take time. The level of energy behind some of the investigations, because you will spend a lot of different hours. Intuition is important. Skepticism. Adaptability becomes very critical for us as well, especially in a lot of the different types of attacks that are taking place. Dan gave the example of IoT as an example for us. There's a level of confidence that's required for us as investigators. Obviously, we have to be just as creative in a lot of the investigations that we conduct. Integrity, professionalism, ingenuity, and above all, empathy in a lot of these investigations. So this investigative forensic skill set, and you'll see this as we go through some of the discussions as relates to the key findings, becomes important as we move forward in a lot of these investigations. Next must be the knowledge of various different risks, vulnerabilities, and we must be able to identify weaknesses in the enterprise. We must be aware of the kinks that are in the armor within the organization. In essence, we a lot of times are looking at different types of attack models, like the MITRE attack model, as an example, where we're dealing with new vulnerabilities and each day. So we must not only know the past vulnerabilities, we must also live in the present with a lot of the vulnerabilities that we see, and also have an eye towards the future, which is equally important. The third perspective for us is we must have repeatable processes. And here, and for this one, we have to adhere as forensic experts to the rules of evidence. And we're going to talk about some of those. What we do must be courtroom admissible. It must be complete. It must be authentic. It must be believable and reliable as we look through and investigate different cases. And it's interesting with this particular one as well also, because as we're conducting these types of investigations, within organizations, it's important that we deal with these tools because we must be better than the tools that we use, especially in the cases of the efficiency or the effectiveness of a response and the speediness of our responses as well also, which make it very important. So the first three perspectives are important from that perspective. It's the last two perspectives that from when we're interacting with organizations, the final two that are important to them as well also as we're moving through these. Starting with the fourth one here, detection and preventing reoccurrence. And this is an interesting one because we as DFIR consultants, we must understand as we're going through, as Dan was going through those 6 key findings, and provide what we consider to be recommendations or guidance to the organizations to detect and prevent reoccurrence. And I want to pause there because I said to detect and prevent reoccurrence. I did not say prevent, and the reason why I did not say prevent here is because the attack or the event has already happened in the environment, so we're brought in at that point to detect and prevent the reoccurrence of it in the future, which becomes important for us. So that becomes important within an organization. And for the final perspective, definitely from an organization standpoint, organizations are entities that must thrive and must survive. Therefore, they're seeking ways, and we have to provide recommendations to them to limit damage, recover, if you will, quickly, and minimize business impact or business disruption as well also. So as we're going through the key areas, you're going to hear us talk about these different perspectives as it relates to the different environments. So let's start with the threat landscape first of all, and this is an important landscape, and then I'm going to work with you on this as we go through this. But let me start from the beginning of, there are different types of assets that are critical importance to the organization. These different types of assets, as you can see on the right-hand side, these assets, these are the things that the attackers want, things that the organization wants to protect. And in some cases, these assets serve as a stepping stone or serve as stepping stones to other items within the organization. So with these assets in place, threat actors on the left-hand side of the slide, the threat agents, if you will, they launch threats. These threats that they launch introduce risks to our assets. Since these threats introduce risks to our assets, to obtain access to those assets, the threat actors, through the threats, launch what they call exploits. And that's an important thing because we have to not only identify who the threat agents are, we have to become knowledgeable of the exploits that are used in these key findings. Now, when an organization introduces an asset into their environment, say they place the asset on top of a server or within an application as an example, the organization through that system is introducing different types of system vulnerabilities. So not only now must we understand the exploits, we must also understand the system vulnerabilities that are introduced into that environment. Now, since systems have vulnerabilities, most organizations will implement security safeguards or security controls to prevent or restrict these different types of exploits, or at least to detect these different types of exploits. And that is the landscape that we're dealing with. We're dealing with agents, we're dealing with exploits, we're dealing with identifying what are the assets of value, what are the vulnerabilities of these systems that contain these assets, and if the security safeguards are in place, are they effective security safeguards in terms of preventing or detecting whatever types of exploits are being launched against those assets? So when we perform threat models, we look at different types. In some of the cases, you will see in the key findings that we're focusing on the attackers. We'll say that this group is from China or from North Korea as an example. Some cases we'll focus on, some of the models will focus on the systems that are being attacked. We have models for that, as well as sometimes we focus on the assets as well. So Dan, when we look at these threat models here, we look at different things. Anything you want to add to that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, to be honest, Terence. In terms of the landscape as it is, I mean, we have to look at it from a whole picture, not just specific parts of the map which we're depicting here. So at the end of the day, there's always a goal for the attacker, and that is to get to your assets and get to what we class as your crown jewels. So that could be sensitive data or intellectual property. But it's a case of how are they going to get there? Are they going to leverage legitimate services? Are they going to look for potential vulnerabilities within your applications which you're going to be utilizing? So all of these things come into play here, and they all need to be considered during any incident response investigation, and not just look for the low-hanging fruits, because in the background there is always additional activity that's ongoing which could be part of the incident as it evolves.
Thank you. So, with that being said, let's start drilling down into the threat actors in the environment and the innovations that are associated with these environments as well also. So first and foremost, when we're talking about the threat actors are innovating, a couple of things that we're seeing in the course of our investigations. First and foremost, the most common techniques observed globally has been remote code in this unique scenario execution. We're seeing various different types of attacks utilizing remote code and injection. And so we have to be able to look at systems, code in this particular case, the attack type of models that are being used in these investigations that are used by these threat actors, if you will, which becomes important here. Also, what we're seeing from an overwhelming standpoint of success is that things like China Chopper or web shells or exploit kits that target ransomware is important as well. And we're seeing all of these different types of techniques that are being used within these organizations to accomplish this. We're seeing also volume increase of attacks. So in essence, we're seeing a lot of different things that are being successful within these organizations as we go forward. And it presents a lot of different challenges for us as we look at these different things. A couple of things that are important here as we evolve, and since the attackers are evolving as well. First and foremost, we acknowledge the fact that script kiddies or baby hackers do exist. But we can no longer be kiddie forensic examiners, investigating. We can't be uploading to the cloud examiners where we upload malware into VirusTotal or any.run, because that's what the attackers do as well also. They're using some of the same tools. In fact, where there is a Moriarty, we must be a Sherlock Holmes in a lot of these different investigations. So we must have and understand from the standpoint of the evolving nature of the attackers, it is critical for us in our findings to understand the enterprise architectures. And that's an important component for us. As we venture out, we're seeing they have knowledge of the network architecture, the application architecture, even the data architecture that are in a lot of these enterprise architect environments, as well as, and in our cases, the security architectures. So from an investigative forensic standpoint and trying to identify the root cause, it's important for us to really understand the architecture that these organizations are implementing. And that becomes very important. And not only must we understand these architectures, we must have a framework, a methodology, or an approach as we're going through these environments. A lot of times we're finding that there are protocol or vendor vulnerabilities that the attackers are taking advantage of. But more importantly, what we're seeing now in some of these key findings is multi-dimensional attacks. They'll come in through an email credential harvesting link or an attack and target your domain controllers or target other systems in your environment as well also. They also are launching parallel campaigns in the environment where you're just looking for one particular event. They're launching multiple events in the environment as well. So when we're talking about this investigative approach in these environments, it's important for us to really understand the details behind a lot of the infrastructure that is there, because the attackers are evading these infrastructures, and we're trying to put recommendations or provide recommendations to the client or to the organization, and at the same time, we're trying to identify and prevent these things from reoccurring. So not only do we need to implement defense in depth type strategies, there are really 11 different security strategies that we come across when we're in these engagements that we are taking into consideration. A defense and diversification strategy where the perimeter firewalls may be, our devices may be Cisco, and the inside perimeter devices may be Palo Alto, as an example, thereby preventing an attack against a Cisco device to propagate within the organization, because organizations have the same devices at each of the different layers, as an example. We talk about compartmentalization techniques that must be implemented as well also. So when we are looking at these key findings now, and the threat actors are evolving in these organizations, we too must evolve or innovate or look at different techniques as well. So when we're going in now in these engagements, we're taking the findings from red or blue or purple teams to assist us. We're playing roles in security assessments now, because these types of models that are feeding us on the DFIR team assist us in providing recommendations and in many cases identifying what the challenges are. A lot of times so that we can get that efficiency and we can get that speed, we definitely have to have repeatable processes and tools. So in essence, now what we're seeing is that organizations are conducting IR plan tests, tabletops, if you will. They're conducting training, and those things are needed more now today than before if you want that level of efficiency. So when we're looking at some of these sophisticated attacks that are taking place, these are some of the things that we are talking about with organizations. Now, in the world of detection and prevention occurrence, gone are the days of looking for IOCs only, because they could change an IP address. They can change a hash value. They can change a URL or a fully qualified domain. While those static techniques are still important to us, we're beyond those static days of IOCs. And as a result, we need to start implementing different types of behavioral analysis techniques and predictive analysis techniques where we are looking at attack trees and attack forests, or what we talk about is linear regression and K-neighbor type of algorithms for deep learning. They're using it, so as a result, we're seeing just the techniques that they're using, they're evading those age-old security controls that were there as well. So the whole infrastructure of IOCs is shifting because of the innovating nature of the attackers. They're leveraging artificial intelligence, and so must we in this space. And that's what we're seeing as we're going through some of the key findings. So when we talk about the threat actors are evolving, we too have to evolve. We too have to come and implement different approaches to the environment as we move forward. And finally, when we look at how do we go about limiting damages in the environment, we must provide, as I was indicating earlier, improved architecture designs, along with, in many areas, cyber security, which is important as well also. Dan?
So, cheers for that, Terence. IoT weaponization. So this is quite a big observation that mass data has been analysed on, and especially in relation to terms of botnets. So when it comes to botnets, this is really dominant in the field today. So they've pretty much advanced themselves in terms of their capabilities. It's not just a case anymore of infecting a host and executing commands, but they're actually fighting other malware on systems that they interact with. So when it comes to IoT weaponization, how are they exactly compromising these devices is one of the questions that is often asked. But it's simply a case of mass scanning various different IP address ranges, and that also includes often avoiding specific hard-coded IP addresses, maybe for reasons of not targeting specific targets. But subsequently, it's not, once they've also scanned those IP addresses, they're looking at vulnerabilities that could be associated to those devices. And when it comes to IoT devices, this is a plethora of different types of devices which could be affected. However, it mostly focuses around routers. So typically people would install routers and configure them and leave the default credentials in place. Now, this is often the case, and it's fairly easy then for any attacker to kind of come in and leverage those credentials to hijack the devices and take control of them for malicious purposes. And we've seen this with various different kind of botnets, with the Mirai botnet as well, that's been targeting, D-Link routers and various other types. So what's the main purpose of this? Is the focus is primarily to launch subsequent attacks, and this is ideally large-scale distributed denial of service attacks, which we've seen time and time again, especially in the news, which have been hitting various different institutions and financial industries and banks. I think with also the deployment of 5G networks upcoming, this activity is going to increase as well with more and more IoT devices. So when it comes to organizations, what can they kind of do to help in terms of instant response type activities? So making sure IoT devices are included in asset discovery and asset management is a key one, because if you can't simply identify these devices within your network, then you're not going to realize if they're being utilized or leveraged or not. But also, in parallel to that is looking at how they are configured as well, and not utilizing the default credentials that are associated to those devices. So carrying out frequent configuration audits will help to ensure that they remain secure. Of key importance, as you'll probably hear me mention numerous times throughout this talk today, is pretty much around vulnerabilities and ensuring that they are patched. If not, you're going to end up as part of a botnet, and your bandwidth usage is going to increase, and you will see time and time again significant traffic entering and exiting your environment. So organizations need to be a bit more proactive when it comes to detecting this type of activity. So this could include network monitoring and analyzing the traffic. It's often the case that static IOCs, as Terence has kind of also mentioned already, we do see that the similar IP addresses are being utilized to perform the scanning and exploitation. So as these are popping up time and time again, organizations need to be utilizing threat intelligence during their analysis. If you leverage this when you're analyzing the traffic and looking at the logs, then this will help you when it comes to identifying the abnormal traffic. In order to limit the damage and reduce exposure time which organizations could face with this, you need to consider various different types of things, but the primary ones which you need to focus on is looking at the configuration of devices. Potentially you may need to switch to backup connections, etc., if you are becoming a target of this, but also in addition to that, it's changing the filters and the way in which these devices operate within your network as well. Moving forward a bit, in terms of detecting specific botnet-related activity, or it's always also possible that you may become a victim of a DDoS attack yourself, because a lot of the time devices which have been infected as part of these botnets can in theory type malfunction or be left in situ. So you need to be carrying out frequent tabletop exercises to assess your procedures and how they perform against these types of incidents, and that will help you identify the gaps and show where you need to strengthen them as well.
Thank you, Dan, and those are some important things for us to consider. One of the things that we found during the analysis and some of our investigations, and is aligns with the key findings as well, or the key insights, was that attackers are still utilizing old vulnerabilities across the board. They're still, using protocol and vendor vulnerabilities that existed in time past, as an example. And that's an interesting finding, especially at this stage of the game, because organizations and vendors are very good at publishing and making known their vulnerabilities and how to circumvent or work around or patch these particular vulnerabilities. We're also seeing, as a result of a lot of these vulnerabilities, and it becomes important from an investigative forensic standpoint, that we deal with some of those vulnerabilities that allow the attackers to live off the land. They're, at this point, not only are they living off the land, we're finding that they're planting gardens in some of these places as well. Also, when you talk about an attacker being in your environment over 100 days, as an example, that's a season for some of these types of events. So it's important that when you're conducting some of these forensic investigations, that you have the knowledge of some of the old vulnerabilities, especially as they're being applied. We see in the news today the Palo Alto vulnerabilities, the Pulse Secure vulnerabilities. We're now seeing not only operating system type vulnerabilities, we're seeing network device and perimeter device type vulnerabilities that exist as well. So these models, like the MITRE framework, becomes very important. Tools like endpoint detection becomes very important when we talk about the ability to identify some of these types of vulnerabilities that's in the environment. And more importantly, from a process and a response perspective, we're beginning to see organizations trying to prevent these things from occurring by implementing various types of segmentation models, various types of virtualization models in their organizations. However, when I talk about the different types of security strategies that we are recommending that organizations are beginning to implement, effective security controls or defensive security controls are important, but there also must be a proactive trusted architecture implemented as well, also for detection and preventing reoccurrence. So now you're beginning to see the push to implement on the front end different trusted models as well going forward. But again, even though these vulnerabilities are old, organizations still need to continue, if you will, with the necessary things for a rapid recovery. They need to continue the things to minimize their business impact. And again, we're seeing in many of our engagements now where our customers are now turning to their cyber insurance organizations to get direction and guidance as well. And this is actually kind of a unique situation, because if it is an old vulnerability, and it is well known, shouldn't an organization have already taken care of it or addressed it? So then therefore, should the cyber insurance organization be responsible based upon an audit or finding in that organization as well also? So when we're looking at some of these different types of attacks, we're seeing an increase in it, but it is definitely, they're attacking VPNs, they're attacking actually protocols again as well also. So we do see that in a lot of our engagements. Dan?
Fourth key insight for BFIR. So content management systems. This is something that we've come across a fair amount on engagements, but we can also see just from, reading the various stories that you can see online, the amount of destruction that's occurring here. So this is pretty much one of the dominant activities that we've been monitoring and also dealing with in terms of instant response engagements as well. So typically, when it comes to CMS platforms, it's often the case that, again, they're just not configured correctly, or they host a variety of different vulnerabilities. Now, many of these could be potentially zero-day exploits, or they could be other vulnerabilities potentially associated to services that aren't being utilized. So, this is quite a significant risk there. And if you aren't utilizing those services, then there's not much point in them being in place, because all that's presenting is further risks to your environment. When it comes to threat actors and content management systems and attackers trying to infiltrate them, what we often see is various different types of code injection, or potentially trying to implant malicious scripts onto legitimate pages. All of this is for malicious intent. When it comes to investigation efforts around this, so on instant response type activities, a couple of the main things that we need to kind of focus on is around pages which are potentially being affected and any of the malicious code that may have been embedded on those, but also always of key significance here comes down to log files associated to those systems, which may or may not always be retained as well, because it's often the case that in order to compromise any of these systems, that the attacker will have at some point carried out some sort of reconnaissance of the target domains which they intend to target. And this could simply be vulnerability scanning, which, trying to identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities associated to those platforms, or a variety of other actions which they may be interacting with your domain. So as some of you may have seen last month in a specific blog post that I also released, it's pretty much vital that when it comes to your CMS platforms, that you're monitoring the logs and ingesting those and applying threat intelligence to those to identify and block the specific requests or that malicious traffic. Leveraging your web application firewalls will pretty much sort out a lot of this interaction when it comes to bad traffic. If you don't have a web application firewall in place, or logs are not being ingested, then it's going to be quite a difficult task when it comes to detecting and potentially preventing these types of attacks. So what are some of the things you can do to try and help identify and mitigate the risks early on? This comes down to organizations and how proactive they are, and they need to be proactive in their approach. This pretty much means carrying out frequent assessments of their applications to identify the vulnerabilities, vulnerability scanning, help identify the zero-day exploits or potentially newly documented vulnerabilities which could pose a risk. If you do identify these potential risks, you can then carry out a risk assessment and see if it's acceptable or not, or whether you need to implement changes to make sure that they are locked down. It's not just a checkbox exercise, but one which will benefit organization and help secure you. If you want to be extra proactive, you could potentially look at penetration testing activities, which would help you identify the gaps in your defenses ahead of the proactive threat actor. Another proactive measure, one which is implemented in most organizations but often overlooked, comes down to patch management programs. So in order to make sure that the vulnerabilities are patched in a timely and consistent manner, you need to make sure you have a sufficient program in place that can deal with them. It's a relentless task, but someone has to do it, and 9 times out of 10, these systems are being exploited by simple vulnerabilities which could be patched. To further enhance your security posture when it comes to CMS platforms, we also kind of look at advising implementing a set DevOps program to ensure that the smooth and secure development and integration of applications takes place. And this is crucial nowadays of a part of any security program to ensure your code is secure in the first instance. When it comes to reducing time, the system downtime and effect on the actual organization, it's important to pretty much make sure that you have a gold copy of your back-end code and the web server itself, and make sure that's securely stored offline. This will really help support the recovery phase and limit the downtime which your platform could be exposed to.
Thank you, Dan. Actually, that's very good, and some interesting comments there when you were talking about some of the source code. In fact, in some of the investigations we're conducting, we're also seeing, as you are aware, that they're modifying configuration files as well in the environment. So not only are they implementing scripts, modifying Java or .NET code in the environment as well, we're seeing that they're actually modifying some of the configuration files that are associated with the applications across the board as well. One of the unique things that we're seeing as well is in this area of, as a key insight, was in the areas of government risk and compliance. One of the advantages we have as a global GFIR team is that we get to see this from a larger perspective as we beginning to see authorities and organizations introduce various different types of legislation, if you will, to address what we consider to be personal data or sensitive information within organizations. And not only are they introducing it, they're also enforcing it through a series of different regulations around the world. And these types of regulations are having an impact on us as well in a lot of our investigations. In this particular case, we're seeing that when organizations implement solutions in the cloud, as an example, where is that data? Where is that system? Do we have jurisdiction to go into that particular country to actually extract or look at the systems in that particular area or look at the data? So not only is it impacting the organization, it has an impact upon us during our investigations across the board. So we have to deal with various different types of countries and laws that are associated with these particular countries as well, especially as they're launching different attacks on the global scale within different organizations as we see. So as we're conducting these types of investigations, from our perspective, we're definitely looking at different things to take into consideration. Another thing that came up during one of the investigations was the response times that organizations have, either through their cyber insurance program or because of legislation, where they have so many hours, 72 hours as an example, to provide a notification or a response as well also. So that dynamic nature now is requiring us to expedite a lot of the investigations, where in the past in investigations that was not necessarily as demanding upon us as it is today. And if you amplify that on the global scale, it just makes it even more challenging. So this evolving nature, we do see it. We do see it when we are trying to access the data, access the system, especially for systems that are implemented in cloud environments like Amazon, AWS, or Microsoft's environment as well. We are dealing with these issues as well, and it requires us now to have tools that interact in these environments as well also as we go forward. But this particular key finding is definitely having an impact upon us, and it has an impact upon the organization and as we move forward. Ironically, as Dan started early on talking about with different type of health emergencies, ironically, we see a situation today where viruses don't have limitations across the board, and they affect organizations in different ways. But we have to definitely be knowledgeable of, aware of, and address these types of challenges from a GRC perspective when it comes time to dealing with a lot of these organizations and getting access to the data in these different environments also. Dan?
So finally, as we're coming towards the end here, one of the 6 key insights of DFII relates to a shift in sector targeting. So this typically revolves around technology and governmental type organizations. So nowadays, what we're seeing, not just on our engagements, but also out there, is APT groups specifically targeting the tech firms and industrial organizations. And one of the questions is, well, why are they doing this? Well, typically, a lot of the time, it does come down to those types of organizations are considered to have, deep pockets when it comes to finance. So the APT groups nowadays, especially those evolving around ransomware, such as Doppelpaymer, which we've seen on incidents we've dealt with, following post data exfiltration activities, they are specifically targeting organizations in order to cripple their network, stop all operations, and force them to pay up or lose everything. This isn't even the work of, automated malware that we see out there, but it's actually proactive hands-on attackers. And what's quite difficult to kind of deal with there is they're utilizing living off the land methodology and legitimate software tools to carry out this activity on systems. So once they've infiltrated your network, they're looking at network reconnaissance, lateral movement, and various other malicious functions. But as we mentioned earlier, these groups are continuously evolving and trying to remain hidden, so it can be quite difficult to detect them there. There's often occasions where it's made slightly easier when it comes down to the IT infrastructure as well. Around, let's look at an OT example, for example. Sometimes there may be no network segmentation in the core IT domain, and there may be simply other assets that are hooked up directly that are situated within factories which, operate and churn out various types of materials, etc., for these types of organizations. So the attackers are always going to be looking at trying to target systems that are critical to your infrastructure, and these could be those at, the level 3 in terms of operational technology in your factories. Because if they can infiltrate these systems and stop them working, this is going to cost an organization money and potentially force their hand. Whilst ransomware is one of the big ones around right now, there's often times where threat actors will go undetected for weeks, and they won't always show their hand straight away when it comes to kind of ransomware, but they may be looking to locate and extract other types of intellectual property from organizations. This could be anything from financial incentives to source code to new designs, etc. And it's typically the work of state-sponsored groups. So when it comes to this type of activity, being able to effectively respond to those incidents is key. And that's why you need to make sure you're maintaining accurate asset management, but also looking at what security technology you have in place and how you can leverage that in order to reduce the remediation time once you do become a victim. These groups aren't simply, a lot of the time they are targeting things such as phishing attacks, RDP ports, and other unpatched vulnerabilities, but it's important that we do try and stay one step ahead of them, and that means carrying out frequent assessments of your own environment, potentially performing red teaming activities to identify the weaknesses in your infrastructure. In parallel to that, you could be looking at how your defense mechanisms work, carry out some potential tabletop exercises or blue teaming activity to identify where the weaknesses are within your process and how to mitigate them. That in turn will help you improve your security posture. If you've not been hit yet, it's safe to assume you've either not detected it or it's only a matter of time. These types of attacks you're not simply going to always pick up by signature databases anymore. And as Terence mentioned earlier, you need to be looking at MITRE ATT&CK framework, and that should be leveraged to understand the tactics, techniques and procedures, or TTPs as they're known, that these groups are utilizing in order to carry out early detection and prevention of these attacks. Finally, being able to leverage predictive analysis and AI, as well as leveraging various different types of threat intelligence to the data which you're seeing, will help detect them, then again, a lot of it is based on behavior, and that's quite key here in identifying these attackers.
Yeah, one of the things, Dan, one of the things I wanted to add there as you're going through this is that because they're going after intellectual property in some of these nation-state sponsored events, that we're seeing some of the most sophisticated type of attacks across the key areas as well also. So I just wanted to add that in there too, Dan.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. So, you know, I think one of the final things to look at here as well is when it comes to incident management and the recovery side of things. So if you do fall victim to an incident, you really need to be looking at your incident response plan. And if you don't have one in place, then you're going to probably waste a lot of time in terms of hours or days working out communication methods, roles and responsibilities, and so on. So it's really important to make sure you've got a plan in place, make sure it's tested, and make sure that you've got buy-in as well from senior management. Because if you don't, then you're really going to struggle when it comes down to these incidents. Okay, so I think we've got a short amount of time left in terms of, I think we've had a couple of questions come in as well. So we're going to quickly look at those if we've got a spare couple of minutes. Terence, did you want to jump on?
Yes, I'll go through the first one then. I think that one of the questions that was asked is, how do I know if I should work with a partner, or is it better for me to build this capability myself? And I think that the answer is a combination of both. Clearly, organizations will always be, and I mean always, you're always accountable of it in itself. And I think that the desire to build the capability yourself, the training and the insight along those lines makes it really very challenging for any organization, that level of security expertise. So I think that working with a partner is very, very important, but it does not mean that you abdicate your accountability in that particular model, but it should occur in this particular case as well. I think that that's very important. You want to take the next one, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. So another question that's flown in here is, if I had to focus on one thing in terms of incident management and response as a priority, what would that be? I think I slightly touched on it in terms of the recovery and management phase just then on the last deck. So I think having an incident response plan, which has been configured and defined for your organization needs, tested, and has buy-in from senior management is something that, you know, will help support you when the inevitable does happen in terms of an incident. So implementing a proficient incident response plan, making sure it's been tested, making sure everyone knows their roles will really help you when it comes to, you know, potentially falling victim to a cyber attack.
Okay, I think that that's good. I know we're almost out of time. So we want to thank you for the opportunity for speaking with you today, both Dan and I. And we definitely say there are some action items or some follow-up call to action. We mentioned that there was the links, attachments and links within the Bright Talk portal as well also. So in terms of a call to action, by all means, please visit some of these websites that you see posted, as both Dan and I and various members of the GFIR team have developed various different blog or technical blog articles. We definitely invite you to read some of those as well also, which contain a lot of our insight and a lot of our investigations, both on the technology side as well as in the investigative or the skill side as well also. Anything else you want to say, Dan, in closing?
I think we're all there. So, yeah, finally, just thanks for taking the time, and we hope that, you know, you've learned something today or you can take something away and implement that into your organization. And feel free to reach out to us should you like to have a conversation or ask any additional questions which we've not been able to answer today. Thanks for your time.